Alright, so my top 50 rankings for head-to-head points leagues are finally done, and we'll just go ahead and get rated them. But before we do, just a few quick warnings. This is all just my opinion. This is just like who I would draft in this order. This is not necessarily an absolute rule that you need to follow. You can use it as a reference. I'm just trying to be helpful for anyone that's going into their drafts. And also, just as a note, I would definitely wait before, like, at least the week before the season starts to do a fantasy draft. People I've seen in the Discord are already doing their fantasy drafts. This is way too early. Someone could get hurt, etc., shit like that. So definitely consider waiting. I usually do my draft like the day before the season starts. So yeah, and then secondly, this will be an updated rankings list. So like I said, I'm still waiting on some injury news from some guys. Gonna see how some people look. I forgot to put Michael Porter Jr. on the list, and I'm realizing this after editing this now. So he will definitely be in the next version of the list. But yeah, I'm going to constantly update this list all the way till the time of the first NBA season game. So subscribe if you want to stay updated on that. And then lastly, like I already said, this is for head-to-head points league. So just keep all of this in mind. Going to update this list very consistently over the weeks as we get more information, as new trades or as new deals get emerged. So just a lot of different factors. But yeah, so this is, at the time I'm recording this, it's September 14th. So this is as of right now, still like a month to go before the season starts. But let's go ahead and get right into it. So as always, this ranking is going to be based off of total fantasy points with 3 weeks left in the NBA season, because I think that's the point when your fantasy playoffs should be ending. I usually like to leave at least 3 weeks when my playoffs end. So yeah, this is going to be total points at that current moment in time, or who I think is going to have the most, because I think that's pretty much the best metric of how you can rank players in head-to-head points leagues. So we'll go ahead and start off the list with Jalen Green. He's someone who kind of underperformed from a fantasy perspective last year, but he was a rookie, so I mean, what can you expect? It's just sort of the inefficient scoring and not too many peripheral stats, and the fact that they were playing through Christian Wood a lot. But however, if we look at his numbers towards the end of the season, he was a lot better. We were seeing a lot of improvement. He was sort of averaging upwards of 40 fantasy points a game for like the last 10 games there. And while I do think that's a bit of a stretch, I don't think he's going to be that high. I don't think he's going to maintain like the 30 points per game scoring, but I can see his scoring numbers like getting into the 20s. Maybe his peripheral stats get up a little bit, but yeah, it's mainly the scoring. Maybe his efficiency gets a bit better as he gets out of his rookie year, so that's why he's here. And I'll try not to spend too much time talking about every single individual player, but just for the ones that I need to feel like I need to justify a little bit, I'll spend a little bit more time on. And like I said, I forgot to mention, but if you're interested in this entire rankings list, it's going to be in the Discord if you just want like the list of it in like PDF form, or you just want the thing so you don't have to watch the video every time to get the rankings. Going to help you boys out and drop it in there. So the link's going to be in the description. Join it up, and the rankings will be posted in there. But yeah, 49, we got Evan Mobley. I think Lauri Markkanen leaving sort of helps him see his numbers increase a little bit. Again, coming out of his rookie season, I think he's going to be really good this year. Keldon Johnson at 48. DeJounte Murray left. I feel like he's going to be the main option on the Spurs. Towards the end of the season, he was getting a little bit more usage rate. His fantasy numbers were translating into some very solid production. I don't know how the Spurs are going to look necessarily. I was kind of debating who I was going to put here, whether him or maybe Jakob Poeltl, but I decided to go with Keldon Johnson for right now. At 47, we got Paolo Banchero. The only rookie in the list. I'm just a big Paolo Banchero fan, man. Everything I've seen of him, the dude looks legit. I think he's really going to help the Orlando Magic this year with his scoring, and I think he's an underrated form of assists. I think we might be able to see his playmaking translate into some good assist numbers this year, so maybe I'm a little bit high on him for a rookie, but like I said, really like Paolo. I'm very high on him at this current moment in time, so right now he's going to slot in at this spot. Then moving on, if we go on to number 46, we got Cade Cunningham. Again, very solid player, just needs to work out some efficiency issues, but they don't have Jeremy Grant anymore, so Cade's sort of become the de facto number one option, as he always should have been, but that's neither here nor there. So yeah, I'm expecting, maybe an increase in his scoring numbers. If he could touch 20 points per game and then 7 assists, that's going to be beautiful production. I really am interested to see how this sort of turns out. Again, like Jalen Green towards the second half of the season, his fantasy numbers just got so much better, and we saw a vast improvement. So I think the 33 fantasy points per game he averaged last season is a little bit on the low side. I think he's probably going to get up to 35 at the very least this season. So very excited to see where he can do. He could definitely outperform this projection, but as of now, I'm comfortable slotting him at 46. At 45, we have Chris Middleton. This one's subject to change. He is hurt right now. They say they're expecting to be back from the regular season, but can't be too cautious, so this will be updated as more reports come out. And then at 44, we got Jalen Brunson on the Knicks. I am super high on Jalen Brunson, man. Like in games without Luka last season, he averaged 21 and 7. I think he's really going to show out in New York. I think a lot of people are underrating how good of a player Jalen Brunson is. I do think he's going to put up some solid fantasy numbers this season. I think Randall's probably going to take a backseat because Jalen Brunson is definitely better than Julius Randle as a number one like scoring option and like just playmaker in general. So expecting Jalen Brunson to finish pretty high this year in fantasy rankings. Right now I have him slotted in at 44. Moving on to 43, we got Brandon Ingram. I mean, last season he averaged 37 fantasy points per game, which is solid, but we do have the return of Zion. How that impacts Ingram's numbers remains to be seen, but I honestly think he's going to sort of maintain relatively close to where he's at right now with 37 fantasy points per game. So everyone in this list I think is probably going to average over 35 fantasy points per game, but it's just sort of a matter of how many after that. So yeah, anyways, moving on. 42, we got Anthony Edwards. He's someone that originally I am seeing a lot of people draft very highly. I know there's a lot of hype around Anthony Edwards, and he looks really good. I just think it's worth noting that if we're looking at his stats, what are people expecting to see like a massive increase in? He already was averaging 21 points per game last year, 5 rebounds, around 4 assists. I can't see anything like that drastically changing. They've signed Gobert, not that that really impacts his numbers too much. But we got to remember Karl Anthony Towns is still probably going to be the number one option. I can't expect Edwards to sort of overtake him this season, maybe the next one or two. But for now, I'm comfortable putting him here. He averaged 37 fantasy points per game last year, and I'm expecting that to be roughly where he averages around this year, but who knows. And then next we got CJ McCollum at 41. Now that he's on the Pelicans, I was a little bit concerned for his production with Zion returning, like I mentioned with Ingram. But I think CJ McCollum's going to be running the point guard because I don't think they're going to play Devonte Graham or Jose Alvarado that many minutes. So we could see a nice uptick in assists for CJ, and I think that's enough to keep him relevant in the top 50. Well, obviously he would be relevant anyway, but I think that's enough to push him into the number 41 spot. So yeah, that's going to do it from 50 to 41. Now we'll go ahead and get into the next rankings. Alright, so moving on from 40 to 31. At 40, we got Jalen Brown. I'm really expecting him to put up very similar numbers to what he put up last season. He averaged 37 fantasy points per game. He's just a very consistent player. We all know what Jalen Brown's going to do. He missed a few more games than you'd like from him last season, but even then he ended up playing 66. And for me personally, I like players that would play like at least 65. Like if you can get 65 games out of a good player, I think that's an absolute win. So that's kind of like the benchmark I try to look for. Whether there's like a repeated occurrence of them not even getting close to that number, or if they've had repeated lower leg injuries is kind of the only thing that would really knock a player for me, because last year I think I was a little bit too cautious on injuries and I underrated some players that I probably should have rated higher because, like I said, every single player can get hurt. Everyone has their own opinions on injuries and stuff, and I'm only saying this to preface the next two guys on this list, which is Jimmy Butler and Kawhi Leonard. So you might be saying this is way too low for Jimmy Butler and Kawhi, and like I said, this is just the order I would draft these guys in as of right now. I really haven't seen too much to really change my mind. The league has so many good fantasy options this year. Like, this is definitely the most stacked it's ever been when I've been making my rankings. I've had a lot of difficulty deciding where to put guys like this. But if we look at Jimmy Butler, he hasn't played 65 games since like 2018, so that was like 4 years ago now. And we all know, I mean, playoff Jimmy and regular season Jimmy are a lot different. Last year, he only played in 57 games. He averaged 21 points, 5.5 assists. And it's just not what we really expect. Like, playoff Jimmy, definitely going to be closer to top 10. He plays like every game, etc. But for regular season Jimmy, I'm expecting more of the same from last season. A lot of missed games, especially because repeated injuries to the lower body. And also, you know, his numbers are good. Like, if Jimmy Butler does end up playing and not missing that much time, this is definitely way too low for him. But as of right now, this is where I would personally draft him. If you disagree with that, perfectly fine by me. Like I said, these are meant to be a reference. You don't have to be an ass and be like, how could you put Jimmy Butler? You're so stupid. You know, just let me know where you'd put Jimmy, etc. Same thing with Kawhi. Just have not seen him play basketball in so long. I'm going to need to see some updated reports. And like I said, he's even longer than Jimmy. He has not played 65 games since 2016, so almost 6 years ago now. He had the entirety of the last season off, but I just think if we look at the depth of the Clippers team, they're probably the deepest team in the league, so I'm expecting him to sit a lot of games this year. The last 2 seasons in LA, he played 52 and 57 games. If he plays 57 or close to 60, that's probably enough to bump him into the top 30. But for right now, I'm not too sure if that's going to be happening, so I have him at 38. But like I said, I could definitely be really wrong on these guys, so if you want to play it safer, you could take them higher. This is just personally where I would take them right now. 37, we have Zach LaVine. Again, expecting a very similar season out of him, kind of like Jalen Brown. Their team hasn't really changed that much, not really anything that will impact his role, especially Lonzo being out for probably most of the season. I would definitely not draft Lonzo. That's why he's not in this top 50. But yeah, I'm not expecting LaVine's numbers to dip or really increase, just sort of keep the same production he had last season. So definitely a solid pick, and I have him in at the number 37 spot. Then at 36, we have someone that might be a little bit contentious. This is Terry Rozier, and I think a lot of people underrate Terry Rozier for fantasy, especially last season. Like, he was sneakily one of the better fantasy players. He averaged 37.3 fantasy points per game, and the main reason I have him up so high now is that if we think about this recent Miles Bridges news, and like, Miles Bridges is a piece of shit, he should not be allowed in the league. As of right now, I don't think he is on the roster, and I don't think they intend to sign him, but I'm expecting a huge surge in usage from Terry Rozier. His usage rate was around 22.7 last season. I'm definitely expecting that to get an increase to around the 25 mark. Elite players sort of have like the 30 and up mark. Like that's like where you get your Lucas, your Jaws, and stuff like that. So I'm expecting LaMelo to be upwards in the 30s. But Terry Rozier is now like the solidified number 2 option, and I'm definitely expecting him to put in a hell of a performance this season. Super underrated player. I really don't know why. But yeah, if you look at his fantasy numbers, I do think they're going to translate into very solid production, and that's why I have him higher than some guys that are bigger names like the Kawhis and the Zach LaVines. Could definitely come to regret it. Like I said, with all of these rankings, no rankings are going to be 100% right. But just right now, I am really high on Terry Rozier. The Hornets don't have a lot of other options outside of him and LaMelo, so I really think he could have a really big fantasy season. So, moving on to 35, we have Bam Adebayo, who had a significantly less impressive year than I was expecting out of him last season. I had him ranked inside of the top 20, and as we're all aware, that did not end up happening. But he ended up averaging 39.5 fantasy points per game last season. The main thing was his assists were way down since they added Lowry and stuff like that, so he only averaged 3.4 assists last year, but even given that, he almost averaged 40 fantasy points per game, so I think this is maybe a little low for Adebayo, but for right now, I'm pretty comfortable taking him here. If he worked on his scoring, maybe we might see a little bit of a scoring increase if he can consistently get that 20 points per game, and then if he can get up to around 5 assists per game, then he's definitely looking at like a top 25 player. But as of right now, I just don't really see that happen. I'm expecting very similar numbers to last year, and that's why I have him in at the number 35 spot. But like I said, all of these guys are really good fantasy players. These are guys you're taking in like second, third rounds, depending on how deep your leagues are and stuff like that. So definitely players to look at. Nothing, not a knock against Bam or anything, but I do have him coming in at number 35. At number 34, we have Darius Garland. He was someone that I had way higher before they signed Donovan Mitchell. I still don't think he's like gonna fall off a cliff or anything like that. But if we're looking at both of their scoring numbers, I feel like Donovan Mitchell is definitely the primary scoring option. He's a little bit of a better scorer than Garland is at this moment in time. Garland's a little bit of a better playmaker, but I do think Donovan Mitchell is going to take the ball out of his hands quite a bit. So I think this is a pretty fair position to put Garland in. He averaged like 22 and 8.5 assists last year. Probably expecting those assists to drop down slightly, and maybe his scoring gets around 20 points per game. But yeah, I do think that is still enough to finish him at number 34. 33, we got DeMar DeRozan. This is someone that finished incredibly high for total points last year. I believe he finished in the top 10. Yeah, he finished 10th last year, and that was with averaging 42.8 fantasy points per game. And I'm just not completely sold. Like, it's just such an anomaly for a player to have the season that DeMar DeRozan did, which was like the best of their career at the age that he was at. What is he, like 32 years old right now? So definitely expecting to see a little bit of a drop off this year. I'm not quite as confident he's going to average like 28 points per game. But I mean, hey, maybe he does. Maybe I'm underestimating DeMar and he's going to have like one of those MVP level seasons again. I'm just not as confident as that we're going to get a repeat of last year, so I have him slotted in at the 33 spot. Then moving on to 32, we have Bradley Beal. Again, this is someone who unfortunately had a season-ending injury right in the middle of it. Unfortunately, I just traded Anthony Edwards for him at the time too, convinced that this was going to be a steal of a trade. It was not, but I am pretty confident that Bradley Beal is going to be back up and running this year. I believe it was a wrist injury, so not like a problematic lower body one. If this is misinformation, feel free to correct me in the comments. But yeah, his scoring numbers were way down. Last year, he only averaged 23 points per game. And if we look at the previous seasons, he topped 30 points per game in 2020 and in 2019. So in 2021, all the way down to 23. I do think we're going to see his scoring numbers increase again this season. If he can get up to 27 points per game, he's going to be flying. So I think that's enough for me to place him in the 32 range. Like I said, once you see the players above him, you might think he should be higher, but once you see like all the players that I have ranked ahead of him, you'll start to realize like, holy shit, there's a lot of talent in the NBA right now. So 32 for him. Another player coming up next that I am very high on in fantasy is Nikola Vucevic. I ranked him extremely high last year. I had him inside the top 20 as well, and people were sort of giving me shit. And then he had like the worst season he's had in quite some time, and he still averaged 39.5 fantasy points per game. Finished pretty close to the top 10. He finished around 17th in total fantasy points per game last year. And like I said, that's with a down year for Vucevic. His scoring numbers were down. But when you have a consistent rebounding rate, which I talk about all the time with players like him and Sabonis, you're going to have some like okay underlying production if their scoring numbers do take a bit of a dive. But yeah, I'm expecting his shooting numbers to see a slight increase. Last year was like his career worst three-point percentage, I do believe. So if that sees a bit of an increase, I mean, we should see he is a career 35% three-point shooter, and last year he was down at 31, so who knows? The fit with the Bulls has been a little bit problematic, but hey, I'm expecting maybe a little bit of a bounce back. Maybe he'll be a little bit more comfortable this year. We'll see his three-point percentage revert to the mean. But yeah, that'll do it for 40 to 31, and I'll get into the 20s. All right, so starting off the 30s, or starting off with 30, we have Fred VanVleet. Again, another guy whose role I'm not really seeing changing that much. He averaged 41.9 fantasy points per game last season, expecting pretty similar numbers. Just a very solid all-around game from him with like 1.7 steals, 20 points per game, 7 assists. Can't ask for much more than that. Not too much to say with him. Moving on to 29, we got Drew Holiday, who I do think is a little bit of an underrated fantasy player, especially with this Middleton news. Like I said, we gotta see more reports on how that's looking. But even with that, Drew averaged 41 fantasy points per game last year. He just provides very solid all across the box scoring value. So you're getting a lot of assists, rebounds, a few steals here and there, plus like solid like 18.3 points per game. So definitely his ranking is going to fluctuate. I'm sort of operating on like if Middleton's going to miss a little bit of time, that's going to inflate Drew's numbers, leading to more total fantasy points by the end. But like I said, remains to be seen. So moving on, Rudy Gobert at 28, newly acquired to the Timberwolves. I don't see his numbers changing that significantly because it's not like what Rudy does is really impacted by changing to a new team. I think his rebounding rate is probably going to be a little bit higher. I think not higher, sorry. I think his rebounds are going to stay pretty similar to what they're at, and we're going to see Karl Anthony Towns rebounds drop. And then his scoring, it's all just lobs, easy lobs to the rim. He's not really doing anything else other than catching lobs, pick and rolls, etc. So I think averaging around 15 and 15, which he put up last season, is very realistic, along with 2 blocks. And I do think that's enough to slot him in at the number 28 spot. So, yeah, I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe the Timberwolves are going to use him completely differently, and he's never just going to score, etc. But I really don't see that happening. I think he's going to have pretty similar production to what he had in Utah. So, anyways. Moving on, 27, Donovan Mitchell on the Cavs now. Like I said when I was talking about Darius Garland, I do feel like Donovan Mitchell is going to be the primary guy. Whether his scoring numbers take a little bit of a decrease, I could probably expect that. I don't think he's going to average 26 points per game, probably lose maybe 2, around 24. His assist numbers will probably stay relatively similar. It's not like he was averaging a crazy number of assists in Utah, but he's just an overall efficient scorer, averages 42 fantasy points per game last season. I am expecting that to continue on the next season, so not too much to say here. That's why he's down at 27. Nothing wrong with that, but yeah, that's where I'm going to put him for right now. And then at 26, we have like one of my favorite players in fantasy. If you're new to the channel, I talk about him all the time. If you have been here for a while, you already know how much I love Domantas Sabonis, especially now that he's on the Kings. I feel like the pick and roll with him and De'Aaron Fox was really starting to show signs of being something special before they shut him down for the season. But like I said, that's why I advocate for having your playoffs end with 3 weeks left in the regular season, because then you don't have to worry about people resting players or the fake injuries that happen towards the end of the season. A lot of people ask me, like, aren't you worried about him resting? Like, no, if you're setting your fantasy playoffs at the right time, you don't have to worry about that shit. So yeah, Domantas Sabonis, absolutely love him. The rebounding rate, like with Vucevic, 12 rebounds per game, 19 points. I think he'll probably get around 20 points per game again, as he had when he was with Indiana 2 seasons ago. And the rebounding rate, I'm expecting to stay pretty similar. And then the sneakily best part about Sabonis is the 5 assists per game. He's just a very solid passing big man. There's really nothing to not love about Sabonis. I always try to draft him in my fantasy leagues because I got just the bromance with him at this point. So yeah, he's going to come in at 26. And then at 25, we have someone who, one of my worst rankings from last year, De'Aaron Fox. I ranked him like 14th or something, and I am ready to get hurt again because Tyrese Halliburton, I was not expecting him to he sort of became what I thought De'Aaron Fox was going to do last season. He was like their best player while he was there. I'm just going to be honest. I don't know why the hell the Kings traded him for Sabonis, but moving on, De'Aaron Fox, I think he is going to be really, really good next season, especially, like I mentioned, with this Sabonis pick and roll combo. If we look at his stats after Halliburton left and it was him and Sabonis, he was averaging like 28 points per game, and on the season he was only averaging 23. So that's 5 more points a game. He was averaging around 7 assists as well. So if he can get up to that 27 and 7, and that was for like a pretty consistent period of time too. That was for like across like 14 games or something. So bit of a small sample size, but I do think there is something to that, and I am expecting that to continue. I think he's going to be really solid this season, and if you can get him around this range, I think that is a steal of a pick, because I feel like some people might be underrating him just based on his performance from last season. So just something to keep an eye on. His average draft position right now is around 41. Like I said, that's not too accurate because not a lot of people are doing their drafts now, as they should not be, but I do still think he is a top 25 player. So yeah, anyways, moving on to the next player on my list, we got Paul George. This is one I am open to debate about and maybe lowering him because of the return of Kawhi, because of, Paul George does miss some time. But when he does play, he averages around 44 fantasy points per game. And it's not like he missed a lot of time with the lower body injuries, which, as I've said earlier, I do consider to be more like nagging and more debilitating to players. And he did play last season. He played 31 games and he averaged 24, 7, and 6. Like I said, I don't expect his assist numbers to remain that high, especially with Kawhi going. I think he's not going to have the ball in his hands as frequently, but I do expect him to still put up like very similar Paul George numbers. We all kind of know what he does. Elite level scorer, very good playmaker. What can you say? I think he's just too good of a player for me to rank any lower than this, honestly. So he's coming at the number 24 spot. At 23, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Like I said, end your playoffs at least the last week of your finals should be 3 weeks before the season ends, because then Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is a must-have player. Some people are like, oh, Shai's going to rest. The Thunder always sit him out. Not if you end your playoffs at the right time, all right? With 3 weeks left, he was like the number 5 player or something on like the past like 2 weeks. So if you had him in the playoffs, he was tearing it up. But yeah, we're looking at his averages from last year. 24.5 points per game, 5 rebounds, 6 assists. You would like to see his three-point percentage be a bit higher, but even giving that was enough for him to average 43 fantasy points per game last year. I was excited to see how him and Chet Holmgren got on, but as we all know, Chet's out for the season, so I still feel like Shai has pretty much an identical role to what he had last season. I'm expecting pretty similar numbers out of him. Then at 22, this is one that I spent a lot of time deliberating on, and at 21. But at 22, we have Kyrie Irving, and he is just someone that it's like in your head, you're like, I should probably stay away from him. I don't want to deal with the bullshit. But the thing is, the league has sort of loosened their vaccine mandates on where players can play, where they can't. So if we're looking at his per game averages, he averaged 48 fantasy points per game last season. And granted, he didn't play in as many games as most players did, but the Nets really don't have anyone. When he did play, he was playing around 37 minutes a game. Well, that's not going to maintain itself because that's just way too high. Steve Nash does love playing his guys for excessive periods of time. And I just feel like Kyrie Irving is too good of a per game scorer to that you can really leave him for later on in rounds, because he's a guy that if someone in your league drafts him at 40 and he ends up playing 60, 65 games, you're probably going to lose your league to this guy if you let him get into the 4th round. He's just too good of a fantasy player. As much as he pisses me off and how stupid he is sometimes, he's too good for fantasy to just leave for someone else to kind of scoop him up later in the rounds. Is he going to average 48 fantasy points per game? I don't think so, but I don't see him dropping below 45, and that's enough to put him close to the top 20 for me. Like I said, he definitely could burn you, but he's gonna burn you if you leave him for someone else to have later. So just kind of a bite the bullet situation. And yeah, moving on to 21, pretty much the exact same story. Anthony Day-to-Day Davis. Now, I've mentioned this already in this video, but anyone can get hurt in the league. We do have guys that are more injury prone, but like I said, injuries could happen to everyone. They suck. They really just ruin fantasy. Some guys are more prone, but I do think Anthony Davis is someone that you should take around this range. He had one of his worst seasons statistically last year for the Lakers, and he only played in 40 games. And even given that, he averaged 48.6 fantasy points per game when he did play, which was high enough to be top 5 in the entire game, I believe. Or sorry, top 10. He finished around, finished 8th in per game average. So if he finishes 8th in per game average, even if he gets to 55 games, he's going to be a really, really good fantasy player to have. And I think that's good enough to push him into the 21 spot. So there are some guys here who you could say have increased injury risk, but like I said, pretty much every single player that's in this top 50, you could probably make a case for they're going to rest or they're going to miss games or they're going to get injured. So like I said, I'm trying to be less cautious than I was last season because it caused me to underrank a few players, and I just don't want to make that same mistake. So that's going to conclude for 30 to 21. Now we'll go ahead and get into the 20s for my rankings. All right, so at 20 we have Chris Paul, and I know he's 37, and the last 2 years I've been like, maybe Chris Paul's going to have his off year. He's proven me wrong every single time. Last season he put up some pretty solid numbers, enough to secure him 45 fantasy points per game. He averaged 15 and 11 with 2 steals per game. And again, the Suns are one of those teams that really haven't changed their roster too much. I don't see any reason why Chris Paul would all of a sudden fall off a cliff. Maybe he would, but I really don't see that happening. It's just been a few seasons in a row now where he's had such consistent performances, and like I said, time's going to catch up with him eventually, but he didn't really show any sign of slowing it down. I mean, he was kind of lackluster in the playoffs, but it's sort of been the knock on his whole career, and I don't really think it's going to affect his regular season performance too much, so I think that's enough to get him into the top 20 spot. At 19, we have DeJounte Murray, who won a lot of people their leagues last year, and he just had some crazy production as a number 1 guy on San Antonio. He averaged 51.3 fantasy points per game, and I am expecting that to become a little bit lower now that we've seen him on the Hawks. I do think his production takes more of a dip than Trae Young's out of anyone's. I just don't see him still getting the 18 shot attempts per game that he was getting last year. He was averaging 21, 9, and 8. I definitely see the assists coming down. it remains to be seen how Atlanta's going to use him. I do think that I think there's no way they don't use Trey off ball a lot more and use DeJounte to facilitate getting him some more open looks, because Trey does take a lot of contested shots that affects his percentages, etc. But I just think there's no way that DeJounte's scoring and maybe his assist numbers don't see a little bit of a drop off. I don't think he's going to fall below 45 fantasy points per game, so that's why I still have him top 20. But yeah, I don't think he's going to have like the top 5 season he had last season. But anyways, at 18, we got Zion Williamson, another guy who's missed an entire year of basketball like Kawhi Leonard. The only reason I am higher on Zion is because it was just last season. It's not like a trending pattern that they're going to rest him games. He played 61 games the season before, and he averaged 27 points per game. It's just on insane efficiency, 61% from the field. He averaged 7 rebounds, 4 assists. He's just such an unreal player, and especially for fantasy, just because of that scoring in combination with the assist, that you really can't let him fall outside of the second round. I know there is the injury concern. He hasn't played in a while, but all reports do say that he is going to be playing at the start of the season. I mean, we'll have to remain waiting to see if there's any updates on his condition or anything, but he has looked healthy in clips we've seen. There's no reports that say he's not going to play, and he's just too good of a fantasy player to leave any longer than, I don't think he can go outside the top 20, man, because he's a league winner, because he could very easily have top 5 production if he actually plays. So I'm going to put him at the 18 spot. I would draft all of these guys ahead of him, but I definitely think he is a top 20 player. At 17, we got Pascal Siakam. I believe he was second team All-NBA last year, if I'm not mistaken, and I do think he's going to have pretty similar numbers this year. Just a really solid overall player for fantasy. 23 points per game, 8.5 rebounds, 5 assists on very decent shooting splits. He averaged 50 from the field, 34 from 3. His free percentage could be a bit higher, but in combination with all the other factors, it's good enough to put him into any top 20 list. I don't think there's anyone that would really contest this or put him outside of it. He averaged 44 fantasy points per game last year, and I'm going to expect pretty similar numbers this season. Maybe Scotty Barnes sees a bit of an increase, but I don't think it's enough to really disrupt Siakam's production. At 16, we have another Phoenix Sun, Devin Booker. Again, same logic I use with Chris Paul. I don't really see his role changing that much with the Suns. Going to have very similar numbers to last season in my prediction, and that was good enough to put him at around 44 fantasy points per game, or 43 fantasy points per game last year. So definitely expect that trend to continue, and I think it's enough to put him in at 16. At 15, we got Ja Morant. And I know there is the injury concern with Ja Morant. Like I've mentioned before, though, injury concerns with every single player. I'm trying not to be super as cautious as I was last year, because like I said, it led to me underrating a lot of players, and that might lead you to lose your league. So there are some players that are like, hey, I'm going to steer clear of Ja Morant. I don't feel comfortable drafting them. That's perfectly okay. You can take someone else. But me personally, I do think I would take Ja Morant around the number 15 spot. I think that's a really solid place to get the number 1 option on the Memphis Grizzlies. 27 points per game, around 7 assists. Just a huge, just an absolute monster for fantasy production, man. I just love watching Ja Morant play too. Not that has any translation to fantasy, but it's a lot more fun when you have players you like watching on your fantasy team. If you've been playing fantasy for a while, you know what I'm talking about. Anyways, 14, guy that I think might be a little high for a lot of people. I don't think they would have Tyrese Halliburton rated this highly, but it's just because I'm expecting a big increase in his production this season, which was already pretty insane once he got to Indiana. But I am expecting him to average maybe around 20 and 10. I think if there was a season to do it, I think it is this season. I think it's about time. He averaged 15 and 8 last year, but like I said, he was on the Kings for the majority of that. And as soon as he was on Indiana and was the main guy on the team, he was just unreal. He was putting up crazy stat lines, averaging over 40 fantasy points per game, very consistently. On the season, he averaged 42 fantasy points per game. I am expecting that to get above 45. That's why I have him all the way up here. But yeah, just super consistent production. Nothing but good things to say of him. Really high assist rate. I think his scoring is going to take an increase. So very curious to see how the season goes, and that's why I have him ranked so highly. And then we have another point guard at 13. This time it's LaMelo Ball. And losing Miles Bridges, like I've already mentioned when I had Terry Rozier on, I think LaMelo's absorbing all of that usage rate. I think he's going to be playing probably 35 minutes per game next year. His minutes have been a little bit low for a starting all-star. He only averaged around 32 minutes per game last year, but hey, I think he's probably going to average last year's averages. He had 20 points per game, 7.6 assists, average around 43.6 fantasy points. I am expecting that to probably see a bit of an increase. I think he's probably going to crack the 45 fantasy points per game average. He was another player that in the second half of the season was just going absolutely mental. Really solid production, on constant watch for triple doubles, stuff like that. So can't really ask for much more, man. All of the guys in this top 20 are just insane fantasy players, and you're just lucky to have any of them on your fantasy team. But especially LaMelo Ball, again, like Ja Morant, just really fun to watch play as well. Moving on to number 12, we have another guy that missed the entirety of last season. Maybe some people are going to be a bit more be like, oh, I'm not drafting Dame. He didn't play last year. But if we're looking at what the injury was, it was this abdominal injury that he had reportedly been dealing with for 4 years. And he just kept, like, Dame's just a trooper, man. He was just soldiering through it, playing through it for his team. But he finally decided to call it quits, get the surgery. He only played in 29 games last year. And he was having a super down year before he even got the surgery. But going into age 32 season, I am expecting him to sort of revert back to what we're seeing from like prime Dame numbers, which is like 29 points per game roughly. When you combine that with like 8 assists, he's just a fantasy beast, man. And I do think that if someone's going to underrate him in your league, you could absolutely capitalize on drafting him this early. I don't think you're going to really miss out if you take Damian Lillard around this range. He could someone that I could easily see getting into top 10 value. I think he's going to average well over 45 fantasy points per game, probably around the 46 range, 47 range. His average draft position right now is 33rd, which is just ridiculous. I feel like once more people start drafting around the start of the fantasy season, as they should be, that'll definitely sort of get closer to where I have him ranked at now. And like I said, maybe you're not comfortable taking Dame here, but personally, I would take him 12th. So yeah, that's all I got to say about him. I don't think Portland's roster's changed too much, especially with CJ gone. Dame's pretty much the focal point of that team. He does everything, and it's just I'm expecting a big fantasy season out of him. Enough said. At 11, we have Karl Anthony Towns. And the only thing that I took him out of the top 10 for, because every year I think he's like consensus top 10, and even this, I'm putting him at 11, so it's not like I think it's going to be that much different. It's just with Gobert coming, will his rebounds drop maybe 1 or 2? It's not out of the realm of possibility. He's probably going to average like pretty similar in scoring, maybe the 25 points per game, and then maybe around 7 rebounds. Remains to see how Minnesota is going to play. I'm super interested to see how they're going to play those two together. But last season he averaged 46 fantasy points per game. Is he going to average that again? There is a chance maybe see his efficiency jump up a little bit, but I do think he's probably going to average around 45, 46 fantasy points per game. I don't know if he's going to crack top 10, but like I said, if I have him on 11, he's pretty much on the cusp of it, so it's not like out of the realm of possibility. He's just a super solid player. The rebounding rate, the scoring, the efficiency that you get out of Cat, can't ask for much more, and that's why he's going to have him at 11. Then we'll go ahead and get into the top 10, which I have made one change since I published my top 10 list, and it's not like I changed a player, I just sort of changed the order of them a little bit, so we'll just go ahead and talk about that now. All right, so now finishing off, we have the top 10. I'm not going to spend too long on these guys because I've just realized I have talked for a long ass fucking time, and I already just made a top 10 ranking video, so I'll link that in the description if you want to go check it out. You can see what I said about all these guys. The only change I made is I changed the position of Trae Young and James Harden. Like I said, all of these guys are just going to be ridiculous for fantasy. I don't really think there's anything too contentious going on here. I was just sort of thinking about, the Trae and DeJounte combination. And while I do think that Trae's numbers aren't going to change that much because I think his efficiency is going to go up a little bit, that'll sort of off-put any drop in assists we might see. I still think he's the focal point of the offense, etc., shit like that. But we'll just go ahead and quickly read it out. 10, Kevin Durant. 9, LeBron James. 8, Steph Curry. 7, Trae Young. At 6, we got Jason Tatum. 5, James Harden now. 4, Joel Embiid. And then the top 3, of course. 3, we got Luka Doncic. 2, Giannis Antetokounmpo. And 1, we got Nikola Jokic. So that is going to do it officially for my top 50 rankings. I hope it helped you out. Like I said, if you just want the whole list and you don't want to watch the video every time to get them, I am going to post them in my Discord. They'll be under the announcements tab. So if you want to join the Discord, just click on the link in the description. The rankings will be there for anyone who wants them. Hopefully this helps you guys out. Like I said, this is just the order I would personally draft them in. Just my opinion. If you don't agree, you don't have to necessarily draft them in this order. Just use it as a reference. But at the end of the day, it's your decision who you want to draft in fantasy. I'm just trying to help some people make their decision if you're a little confused and just want my opinion. But yeah, like I said, hope this is helpful. If you guys do want a top 75 or a top 100 rankings video, let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in. It took me a long time to make this because I was trying to make it as accurate as I could be, but had a lot of fun making it. Hope it helps you guys out, and as always, I hope you all have a great rest of your day.